It has been over 60 years, and we still don't have answers of Dyatlov Pass incident. What force caused 9 experienced hikers to rip open their tent from the inside? Why did they flee into the deadly cold of a Siberian night, leaving their belongings behind? Why were some barefoot, undressed, running into freezing temperatures? What explains the strange injuries? Broken ribs, fractured skulls. Why was one hiker missing her tongue? Why were traces of radiation found on their clothing? So, what happened that night? These are the questions I've been chasing. Now, let's see how deep this rabbit hole goes. On the morning of January 23, 1959, 10 members of a ski and hiking team boarded a train heading toward the Ural Mountains, deep in the Soviet Union. Led by Igor Dyatlov, the group included 8 men and 2 women. Over the next few days, the team switched between different forms of transportation: bus, truck, horse-drawn sleigh, before continuing on foot and skis. On January 28th, one of the hikers, Yuri Yudin, began feeling unwell and decided to return home. He said goodbye to the others, not knowing it would be the last time he would see his friends alive. The group pressed on, taking photos and writing in their diaries to document the journey. On February 1st, the group reached the base of a mountain called Dead Mountain by the local Mansi people. They spent most of the day climbing the slope and eventually set up camp just below the peak. These final photos and diary entries paint a quiet, eerie picture. One of the last entries reads, "It is difficult to imagine such comfort on the ridge, with shrill, howling wind, hundreds of kilometers away from human settlements." A few weeks after the group was expected to return, friends and family grew worried. No one had heard from Igor or the others. After much discussion, a search team of volunteers was formed to find them. On February 26th, the search party discovered the hikers' campsite on the slope. What they found was deeply unsettling. The tent was partially buried under snow, its fabric shredded from the inside out. The following day, volunteers noticed 9 sets of footprints leading away from the tent. The tracks were shallow, suggesting the hikers had walked calmly rather than run in panic. The trail was visible for about half a kilometer before it disappeared under fresh snow. Continuing in the same direction, the searchers found 2 bodies under a large cedar tree near the forest's edge. Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonichenko were lying next to the remains of a small campfire, frozen in place. Shockingly, they were nearly naked, dressed in only light shirts, underpants, and socks. The cedar tree itself showed strange damage, with broken branches up to 5 meters high. Perhaps someone had climbed it to look for the tent in the darkness. 3 more bodies were found scattered between the tent and the cedar tree, partially buried under a thin layer of snow. They were better dressed than the first 2, but still lacked essential winter gear like boots, gloves, or hats. While some showed minor injuries, all 5 hikers had died of hypothermia. The remaining 4 hikers weren't found until months later, buried under 3 meters of snow at the bottom of a small ravine about 75 meters from the cedar tree in the opposite direction of the tent. Their deaths were even more mysterious. 3 of them had suffered fatal injuries. 1 had a fractured skull, and 2 had broken ribs and severe internal bleeding. Even more disturbing, 2 of the bodies were missing eyes, and 1 of the women was missing her tongue. The 4th hiker in this group had a broken nose and a twisted neck, but ultimately died of hypothermia. Adding to the mystery, 3 articles of clothing from this group were later found to have unusual levels of radioactivity. The discovery raised far more questions than answers. On May 28th, the criminal investigation into the Dyatlov Pass incident was closed. The lead investigator's final report reads, "The cause of death was an unknown compelling force which the hikers were unable to overcome." Not exactly the kind of resolution that brings peace of mind, is it? One of the most infamous aspects of the case is that Lyudmila Dubinina's tongue was missing. Some claim it was cut out while she was alive. Others say scavengers ate it post-mortem. But here's what the medical report actually says. The diaphragm of the mouth and the tongue is missing. That's it. No dramatic language about cutting, tearing, or removal. To put it in perspective, the same report notes, gaping orbits, the eyeballs are absent. But the examiner offers an explanation. Soft tissue injuries to the head are post-mortem changes to Dubinina's corpse, which was recently exposed to water prior to detection. This wasn't unique to Dubinina. The last 4 bodies were severely damaged due to melting snow and exposure. Another perplexing detail: 3 articles of clothing from 2 hikers were found to be radioactive. Sounds sinister, right? But let's examine the data. Under normal conditions, an area of 150 square centimeters should not exceed 5,000 dpm. The garments in question measured 5,000 dpm, 5,600 dpm, and 9,900 dpm, barely above the threshold. The report speculates. The clothes were contaminated as radioactive dust fell from the atmosphere, or the clothes were susceptible to contamination when in contact with radioactive substances. But consider this. Kolevatov had ties to a nuclear development facility, and Krivonishenko worked at a plutonium production plant, and the 3 articles of radioactive clothing belonged to Kolevatov and Krivonishenko. There's no clear link between UFOs and the hiker's disappearance, so let's focus on the real mystery. Here's what I think is the most likely scenario. We know they used the stove that night because fried ham and bacon were found inside the tent. The key lies in the homemade stove they used that night. After taking the stove apart and removing the exhaust pipe, the embers inside reignited. Without the pipe, smoke would have filled the tent in seconds. Desperate to breathe, they cut holes in the top of the tent to vent the smoke. When that didn't work, they slashed the side open and fled in a panic. Once outside, they faced freezing temperatures, underdressed, and a snowstorm. They likely decided to head for the nearest shelter, the woods. When they reached the woods, they tried to build a fire. Some climbed trees to gather wood, while others, better dressed, moved deeper into the forest. About 75 meters from the tree, 4 of them triggered a small avalanche and fell into a 3-meter ravine filled with rocks and ice, suffering fatal injuries. The other hikers split up. 3 tried to return to the tent but froze to death along the way. The last 2 stayed near the fire but eventually succumbed to the cold as the flames faded.